Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk on liberal theory of Indian states. This is the first lecture where we are going to get in-depth knowledge, because for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha has immense experience and he believes that whatever he has learnt and whatever he has received through his academic career should be disseminated to the students. Therefore, through the live platform of CEC, he always believes to give his best. Now, let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, once again, and let's try to have a vivacious session once again too. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetkazi. Good afternoon. Today's lecture is devoted to the issue of liberal theory of Indian state, because and this is the part one of our series of lectures on this topic. In fact, this liberal theory of Indian state becomes very important because normally it is believed that India is a liberal democracy, and therefore the state institutions, the nature of state institutions and state power is also a liberal in nature. So therefore, in fact, this debate has been going on among political scientists, among scholars, that what type of the state India established after independence, in 1947, how to understand the nature of institutions, political power, and so on and so forth. Now, what we find that this entire discussion on the nature of Indian state is normally divided into gets divided into two ideological camps. One is the liberal school or liberal approach, another is the Marxist approach. Liberals have their own way to analyze political power, political institutions. So is the case with Marxism. So Marxist interpretation or Marxist approach to analyze Indian state and institutions, their approach to look at the political power in India is different from what liberals normally do and normally they analyze. So therefore, these two approaches are quite significant from the point of view of understanding nature of political power, nature of political institutions, and also the functioning of the Indian state. Of course, one thing is very important to remember at the very outset, that this entire issue of state power is of course a integral part of this entire discussion in political science, in political theory and comparative politics, because power is seen through number of prisms, and state power is considered to be a very important dimension of human life. Now, what is a state is also is also important here. A state is organization of power at social level, and therefore, in fact, this is articulation of social power. Of course, the liberals and the Marxists have interpreted a state in a different way. In fact, for Marxists, a state is nothing but the agent of the bourgeoisie or the instrument of the ruling class to serve their interests, whereas the liberals look at a state as autonomous institution, in fact as an institution which serves the interest of the society. It is outside society, and therefore the civil society state distinction is often made by the liberal tradition. Now, so of course there is a theoretical debate on this issue. I don't have to go into those issues that how liberals and Marxists get divided on this question of the autonomy of a state, the functions of a state, the nature of a state. For example, the Marxists would not concede any autonomy to a state. At most, they would concede only relative autonomy to a state, particularly the way Marx analyzed the relative autonomy of Bonaparte's state. Whereas the liberal scholars normally give a lot of autonomy to a state from societal interests and societal forces, because it looks at a state as a neutral, impartial agency through the interest of the entire society is served. So therefore, there is a radical difference in terms of the approach, in terms of the entire method, and in terms of the conclusion they arrive at. Now, this liberal theory of Indian state therefore becomes important. because when you say liberal theory of Indian state, we have to keep into mind certain things. Number one, that what are the features of liberalism or the liberal state, and whether those features are available in India or not. If they are there, then what form? Has Indian situation modified them, or basically practices them in the same form? One thing is very clear, that when India got independence and decided to embark on the path of democracy, in fact, the objective conditions, the material conditions which were required at that time in theory, in political theory for success of democracy, those conditions were missing here. For example, literacy, in fact, was a very important consideration. Economic development was important consideration. Kind of social fabric, which was considered to be important for democracy, for fraternity. All those things were missing here, because India was considered a hierarchical society. There were a lot of inequality, there were a lot of poverty, illiteracy, and so on and so forth. But still India embarked on this path of democracy, and therefore it became also a puzzle for many scholars, many political scientists, how to explain the success of India's democracy, because many other countries where democracy started with India, they collapsed like a house of cards. But India, election after election successfully practiced this democratic process and democratic politics. So this is a separate debate among political scientists on the working and the success of India's democracy. But this entire issue of the liberal features of Indian democracy, or the liberal features of political institutions, and here we are concerned with the liberal features of Indian state, is something important to find out, that how this liberal theory of Indian state is constructed, how this liberal theory of a state is built. Now, of course, one thing we should remember, that there are a lot of debate on the issue of state-government relationship, because state is a broader category and concept. Government is slightly narrower, because government is agency of the state. Now, of course, it is also argued that a state is an abstract concept, whereas the government is more descriptive concept. One can see this government through its expression, through its institutions, through its articulation, whereas the state is only to be seen at the abstract level. So a state government distinction is there. There was a time when the liberal scholars only talked of government. Later on they started discussing the state, but of course discussion of a state is not new to comparative politics and political theory. Now, but after this behavioral revolution shook political science, and when new innovations were made in name of system theory, structural functionalism, even in that spell, under the spell of this behavioral, structural, functional revolution, we can say that this entire discussion of political science and comparative politics shifted from state to government. And therefore, what is interesting to see, that in India in 50s and 60s, the important writings which came on Indian politics, which basically shed a lot of valuable insights on the functioning of political institutions, those studies did not use the term state. They rather prefer government, or in fact some of them prefer the term political system, which was basically the gift of this revolution in political science, that is structural, functional, and the behavioral evolution. So system was system, that word system or the term system was more common in political science literature. For example, Rajni Kothari, one of the eminent political scientists and observer of Indian politics, his classic work Politics in India uses the term political system. So is the case with many other Anglo-American scholars. In fact, Rudolphs, one can say, Palmer, and many others. Of course, Morris Jones was slightly more aware and sensitive about this distinction, but nonetheless, even Morris Jones, we find that he used the term government instead of the state. He basically made very perceptive observations. He did a pioneer work on political parties and institutions, but the term which he preferred was government, not the state. So therefore, this discussion of a state was ignored. At least the discussion in the name of a state was ignored. But nonetheless, those issues which are normally discussed under the discussion of a state, those issues were discussed. Political institutions were discussed. In fact, constitutionalism was discussed. In fact, many other issues were discussed. But in fact, they were discussed under different nomenclature, not under the nomenclature of a state. But of late, particularly in 80s, we find that this term state has made a very powerful comeback in comparative politics and political science. And accordingly, we find that in India also, not necessarily influenced by this coming back of the state in comparative politics, but one can say at its own, it got revived. And therefore, the same Rajni Kothari, which used political system in his politics in India, in his later writings in 80s, particularly his State Against Democracy and many other writings, we find that he started using the term state. So is Rudolph and Rudolph, Lloyd and Susan Rudolph. For example, in his mid-80s publication, In Pursuit of Lakshmi, Political Economy of Indian State, again we find that the term state has been used very prominently by the Rudolphs. So I mean, this is a revival. So what we find that now we can see some sort of convergence when the earlier only Marxists were using the state, not political system. Now liberal scholars also started using the term the state, of course with different perspective, with different approach and altogether different methodology. So this is how one can say that the state government thing and a state political system dichotomy has been there. But when we discuss liberal theory of Indian state, what we have to see that we have to take a broader view of it. Even we have to include those who earlier talked about political system or those who talked about government, and later on they embraced this term the state. So therefore what happens that their writings in the last 7 decades after independence, we have to basically take into account that how they have analyzed this Indian state from the point of view of liberal theory. And therefore, it is not only their writings, their approaches, but we have to see the real conduct of the affairs of politics. We have to take into account the operation of entire democratic process. We have to take into account this entire constitutionalism and the constitutional discourse which has happened in India. We have to take into account the many protests and also the kind of dissidence, or one can say the rebellion against certain tendencies which developed within the state and how people fought for it. So all these things have to be discussed if we have to develop a comprehensive view of the liberal theory of Indian state. Now, of course, when we talk of liberal theory of a state, before I proceed further and look at that how Indian liberalism took shape in India, how the roots of liberalism developed in India, particularly during colonial period, that what is considered as the period of colonial modernity, when for the first time a new middle class emerged with enlightenment values, basically impressed by enlightenment values, and how they aspired for a representative government, rule of law, freedom of press, and many other things which are the hallmark of any liberal society and the liberal state. But that happened in the colonial period, when one can say that Indian Renaissance took place. Because in West also, as is believed, that liberalism is the product of 2-3 things which happened in quick succession. Scientific revolution, Renaissance, Reformation, then Renaissance, Enlightenment, and all these things produce a kind of churning, philosophical, intellectual churning, which ultimately produce what we call liberalism. And therefore, we have had different traditions within liberalism in political theory, the classical liberalism, then of course 19th and 20th century liberalism, to present day, that is contemporary liberalism, which is also recognized with different names, sometimes neoliberalism, neoclassical economics, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in fact, liberalism has its roots in a certain set of revolutionary changes in society, and therefore some of the revolutions have played important role in the birth of liberalism. For example, the French Revolution, American War of Independence, the Glorious Revolution in Britain, all these revolutions, 1688 Glorious Revolution, 1789 French Revolution, 677 this American War of Independence. So therefore all of them have contributed to rise of constitutional government, constitutionalism, liberal values, be it liberty, equality, justice, fraternity, rule of law, separation of power, federalism. These are the innovations which have been made by the liberal theory, and accordingly the conduct of a state was strictly done according to these liberal values and liberal principles. So this is how liberalism developed. But so far as a state is concerned, a liberal theory of a state from the very beginning has been suspicious about the state power, and therefore it is normally believed that liberalism in classical form believed that the best government is that which governs the least, therefore the minimal state, and what is basically associated with the laissez-faireism of Adam Smith, Ricardo, and many other classical thinkers. So therefore this minimal state was the hallmark of classical liberalism. They believed in autonomy of individual, they believed in a rule based on consent, they believed in representative government, but they always suspected or looked at the state with sense of suspicion. And therefore what we find that the liberal theory of a state was constructed under this milieu, where the state was a suspicious agency in the eyes of the society. And therefore in fact we find that the social contract theorists who built the foundation for modern state on basis of consent of the people, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, particularly Locke and his idea of constitutional government, and therefore not only constitutional government but his entire idea or theory of property, which is equally important for liberal theory. Therefore Locke at times is remembered as the father of liberalism because of two important features we find in Locke. One, the theory of property, another the theory of consent and limited government. So therefore this is how we can see that a liberal theory of a state was built over the ages. Now of course with many things, as I mentioned, the consent, constitutionalism, rights, autonomy of individual, and last but not the least, the entire idea of tolerance, which is basically nothing but the way we understand in India secularism. That how tolerance about multiple identities, about multiple existence of the people, a multiple way of life is also some very important part of the liberal theory, both in terms of understanding of state power and in terms of the functioning of the state. So tolerance as important as rights, liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice. So this is how liberalism can be understood. Now we have to see that how according to this theoretical frame we can analyze the Indian state, that how Indian state can be considered a liberal state. If it is a liberal state, then how these features work themselves out in India. If it is a deviant case, if it is not a liberal state, if it these features are not available, or if those features are available only selectively, or have been modified, or have been not operated upon, or one can say that have not been practiced in in its fullness, in their fullness, then how to provide an alternative explanation and interpretation. For example, I mentioned at the very outset that the Marxists would simply dismiss all these things, and they said that liberal entire approach to a state is highly superfluous, and that smacks of duplicity, because they look at the state as an autonomous neutral agency. But the fact of the matter is that a state is nothing but the agent, or one can say the agency of the ruling class. This is the position which Karl Marx took in his Communist Manifesto, and therefore this is called manifesto view of the state. Of course, later on Marx also modified his view when, in particularly his writing 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, when he talked of the relative autonomy of the state. So therefore, one thing is very clear, that from the very outset Marxism looks at a state in class terms, and therefore the analysis is primarily done from the point of view of the ruling class politics, that a state serves the interests of the ruling class. But the liberals, as I mentioned, look at a state as a neutral and autonomous agency, and for Marx and for the Marxists this is nothing but an attempt to camouflage the real contradictions in society. This is to befool the people in the name of democracy. Even the liberal democracy, they do not think very high of liberal democracy, because they feel that this democracy is sham. Of course, that is a different issue. Now, what I am trying to mention here, that this liberal theory of Indian state therefore has to be seen from the point of view of two things, that how liberalism took root in India, how liberal ideas became popular and dominant, and how those ideas gradually got translated into action. Through the Constituent Assembly, through the drafting of the Constitution, through the incorporation of many liberal principles in India's Constitution, and finally through the conduct of democratic politics in last 7 decades on basis of these liberal principles. So therefore, this is how we can make sense of this entire discussion, that is the liberal theory of Indian state. Now, for example, the first important issue is that what type of liberalism India developed or embraced. Because I have mentioned that liberalism, of course, is not a very homogeneous concept even in the West. There are many traditions which developed in name of liberalism. If you have the classical liberals like Adam Smith, Ricardo, and and many others, Locke and others, then of course the subsequent liberals like John Stuart Mill, Green, and in 20th century, which basically the dividing line between this welfare theorists and the liberal scholars started getting thinner and thinner, with many other scholars emerged, many thinkers emerged who started talking about a positive intervention of a state in the affairs of the society, and therefore they defined freedom in positive terms, defined a state in positive terms. Therefore, the kind of negativity, the kind of negative approach which was basically championed by the classical liberals was abandoned in the late 19th century and 20th century. And on the other hand, we also find that earlier liberalism, the classical liberalism, preoccupied itself with overemphasis on individual and its autonomy and its freedom. But the later liberals, made concessions, or tried to give this impression that the group identities or at the collectivity in society is also important. Of course, this group rights and other things have become integral to liberalism in late 20th century and 21st century, particularly after advent of multiculturalism and communitarianism like Kamlika and many others. But nonetheless, we should not forget that someone like Green, Beauchamp, Bradley, who at times are referred as idealists, liberal idealists, but nonetheless, if you go deep down into their thought, then we find that they were liberals, but simply trying to harmonize the individual and collectivity in society. So therefore, what we find that liberalism also started moving from its earlier position in the West. Now, in India, from the very beginning, we find that liberalism combined all these traditions, and therefore Indian liberalism, one can say, or Indian liberal tradition has been much richer from the very beginning. As a result of which, we find that India's constitution, when made provision for both individual and group rights, it was a singular achievement, because at that time even in the political theory had not come to terms with, liberal political theory had not come to terms with this group rights and group identity. Even United Nations Declaration, Universal Declaration on rights, human rights, in fact, the group provision was missing. Only later, through many amendments, that United Nations brought all these things into its charter. So therefore, Indian liberalism was born in a different context, in a different milieu. The context and the milieu, of course, was provided by colonial modernity and the colonial rule. But nonetheless, one thing is important, and this is what I was referring to earlier, that scholars have been raising this issue, that even if India witnessed some liberal moments when its founding fathers, the elites, the middle class, which was born in India, due to the colonial modernity, particularly the modern English education, even if they were impressed or they were attracted towards liberal values, but the fact of the matter was that the society in which those intellectuals, those elites, those middle classes operated, that society was essentially illiberal, because it was characterized by hierarchical order, particularly the caste system. So therefore, homo equalis versus homo hierarchicus. In fact, Louis Dumoy, eminent sociologist who has done pioneer work on Indian society, he has called his book Homo hierarchicus, and he has basically contrasted with homo equalis of the Western nature of Western societies. So therefore, this society was illiberal according to many scholars because of the hierarchy, the caste hierarchy, because of prevalence of poverty, because of over dominance of tradition and superstition, because of tremendous role the religion played in the social life, because liberalism was also marked by another important development in the West. This is what we know as a church-state separation. This is how this entire secular doctrine basically emerged in the West, with the separation of church and the state, or church and the political power, particularly after Reformation and and so on and so forth. So therefore, these issues are cited in support of the argument that Indian society was illiberal, and therefore, even if the seduction, the elites were seduced toward these liberal values, but nonetheless it was not possible or it was not very easy to give the foundation for a liberal state in India. And therefore, one is reminded that famous speech of B.R. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly, particularly when he was winding up the debate after this draft constitution was approved, that we are going to we are going to basically witness a situation where there will be political equality, there will be equality in politics, but there will be inequality in society. And this is what he was hinting at, that everyone will have one vote, and that would symbolize the political equality, but the society would still remain hierarchical and unequal. And therefore, he mentioned that contradiction between political equality and social inequality. And he also alerted us to the fact that unless this contradiction was removed, this entire edifice which was created in name of liberal democracy would not have a long life. So this is what he hinted at. At another place in the same speech, he said that top dressing on a soil, basically democracy, establishment of democracy is only a top dressing on basically this undemocratic soil. So all these statements from the founding fathers as well as observers suggest to this fact that this entire debate on Indian liberalism and the liberal state basically centers on these issues, that how this liberal state took root, or basically was founded in a society where the conditions were not ripe for it. Conditions were not conducive for it. So we will basically look at this issue, and then we will proceed the actual conduct of the state in last 7 decades, and do they suggest that India has a liberal state or not.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, we are back after a short break, and you are requested to be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on liberal theory of Indian state, and for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is an eminent professor of political science, and through him we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics and issues. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, once again. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. And in fact, what we are discussing in the earlier part of our lecture was that how this liberal theory of Indian state is constructed, and how there are scholars who basically express their reservation that Indian state cannot be considered purely liberal or cannot be seen purely in liberal terms, and those who do it, they essentially work with a very closed understanding of liberalism, the way it developed in the West, and they normally do not take the heterogeneous nature of this corpus of ideas which are called liberalism, and the different traditions which developed within it, and the kind of changes which have happened within liberalism from time to time. So normally, as I was mentioning, that one issue which is generally highlighted is individual versus collectivity, because liberalism in the opinion of those scholars who are not ready to accept Indian state as a liberal state or Indian liberalism as a true liberalism, they basically believe that liberalism has to discuss only about individual freedom, individual rights, and therefore has to ignore collectivity and group rights. Of course, now that opinion or that point of view does not have a very good purchase, particularly after advent of multiculturalism and communitarianism in late 20th century and the 21st century. This is what I mentioned earlier. But one thing is very true, irrespective of this collectivity and the group rights and versus individual rights. In fact, Indian society, of course, was different from the Western society. There is no denying the fact. And therefore, in fact, this entire speech of Ambedkar, which I mentioned at particularly the Constituent Assembly speech in the earlier part of my lecture, that how Ambedkar also believed that it would be a basically Herculean task to practice a liberal democratic politics in India, and therefore it will be a Herculean task to institutionalize liberal values, because he thought that Indian society was illiberal at that point of time, because still there was a caste system. It was hierarchical in nature. The nature of authority was different. So therefore, the entire social fabric was not very conducive to liberal values and liberal politics. But what we find that in spite of such one can say misfit, or one can say that absence of the conducive factors for liberal democracy and liberal values, the Indian freedom movement, which can be considered as basically the precursor of entire liberalism and liberal tradition in India, basically fancied altogether a different future for India. And therefore, in fact, the freedom movement and most of the liberal thinkers of India basically were schooled during this struggle against colonial rule, be it Ram Mohan Roy, Rana De, Gokhale, those who are called, or Nauroji, those who are or Anand Charlu or Firoz Shah Mehta, those who are normally referred as the moderate leaders. They were basically not only moderates in terms of their approach, but they're also modernists. They wanted a modern India, they had a modern vision for India, and therefore the kind of vision they had about future India, that vision was very close to what we find normally in the liberal tradition, a society and the state in which rule of law would be there, freedom of press would be there will be constitutional rights, there will be government, representative government, there will be government by consent, there will be tolerance. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that this tolerance in liberal tradition can also be seen as secularism in the common in contemporary parlance. So therefore, this entire idea of tolerance was as important to them. So therefore, along with, of course, a nation and nationalism, because they thought that nation and nationalism were important framework through which Indian people could seek self-determination and therefore the freedom for themselves. So therefore, in fact, this was the earlier, the first generation liberal scholars, first generation liberal thinkers, first generation liberal, or the first wave of liberalism or the liberal tradition taking roots in India, when they talked about freedom, they talked about rights, they talked about equality, they talked about justice and all other liberal values. Therefore, what we find that here we can see that Indian liberalism started taking shape. Of course, in India, the way we have discussed in context of West, liberalism also made many modifications, or Indian liberals also had different hues, different colors and different shades. For example, in fact, in 20th century, we find that some of the eminent thinkers and the leaders of freedom movement, they wanted both things. They wanted liberal values like freedom, justice, equality, but at the same time they also aspired for certain other things which normally were discussed in West in name of socialism. That is basically social justice, that is basically economic development, that is the more positive role to a state or state intervention in economy. Of course, in West, of course, the Fabian socialism, which stood midway between liberalism and socialism, these things were articulated more forcefully by the Fabian scholars. So therefore, India also witnessed the second wave of liberalism, which tried to combine all these things, because they were on the one hand attracted and impressed by the liberal worldview, but on the other hand they are also tormented by they were also, in fact, their soul was tormented to see the kind of inequality, deprivation, poverty and injustice which they found within capitalism in the West. So therefore, what we find that they wanted to remove basically the ill effects of capitalism within a liberal society, and they wanted to govern society through liberal values. So therefore, this was a different type of aspiration, and therefore it gave birth to a different type of liberalism, because one cannot call them the socialist in pure in those terms in which normally socialism and the socialist politics is practiced, but nonetheless their socialism was in quite harmony with the liberal values. Of course, socialism, there were traditions within socialism which did not throw baby with the bath water the way perhaps Marxism did, that in name of throwing capitalism, they also some of the traditions within Marxism threw even the democracy and liberal values. But these brands of socialism in the West wanted to retain both the best of liberalism and best of socialism. So when I was referring to the second wave of liberalism, tried to combine these two things. And here one can refer India's first Prime Minister Nehru, or for example many other leaders of the freedom movement who in fact didn't believe in the first wave of liberalism, which only talked about political rights, but they also believed in economic rights. They believed in social equality, and therefore one can also put in this category B.R. Ambedkar and many other modern Indian thinkers, if we slightly broaden this entire net of liberalism. So therefore, liberalism, one can say that started with freedom movement, and of course the way you had Renaissance, social and religious reform movement, the way we had Reformation, Renaissance, Enlightenment in the West, we can see that in India also we had religious reform movement, social religious reform movement, Ram Mohan Roy, Dayanand, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and many others. And therefore, in fact, in West the Reformation and Renaissance were separated approximately by 100 years, but in India, interestingly, both Reformation and Renaissance happened simultaneously. So therefore, basically in the wake of this entire Reformation, Renaissance in India, this liberal tradition started taking a firm shape and firm root, and gradually it got refined, got articulated more forcefully through the establishment of Indian National Congress and its leaders. So therefore, this middle class, the modern elites in India, who on the one hand were uncomfortable with the inequality which they had to face or injustice they had to face in the hands of the colonial rulers, in spite of having similar education and other things. So they became a big critique of inequality, and particularly inequality vis-a-vis the colonial masters, but at the same time they also started critiquing the inequality within society. Initially it was the religious inequality, social inequality, and gradually you find that some of the liberal thinkers started taking up even economic inequality. So therefore this is how this Indian liberalism started taking shape. And then we find that when India got independence and got the opportunity to draft a constitution and form a representative government, it's long, a demand for which they had fought for so long. What they did, that they in fact, constitutionalized those values and institutionalized those ideals for which they were fighting. And those ideals and those values, if we look at, if we run our eyes on the Constitution of India, then we find that those values and those ideals are nothing but liberal values and liberal ideals. And it starts from the preamble of the Constitution, goes to fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, the way the three organs of the government are discussed: legislature, executive, and judiciary, separation of power, a rule of law, and many other provisions of the Constitution, entire federal polity. If you look at all these provisions of the Constitution, we find that essentially they wanted to build a liberal state in India, and this is how perhaps basically they worked in that direction. But of course, that is the constitutional, design of the Indian polity, or one can say that the entire constitutional framework of this entire liberal state in India. But how it has acted, that is also important. There are two parts if in any such discussion. For example, the liberal state of India has to see two things: the overall constitutional design, the governing principles through which the state acts and operates, and number two, the real working of the state, that how it has worked, whether it has worked according to the principles which basically it abides by, or has it deviated from those principles. So this is how a more comprehensive analysis of the liberal state in India would be offered if we have a look at on both things. And this is what we will be doing in our lectures, both today and as well as in the next part. Now of course, before I move further, particularly after looking at the Indian constitutionalism, the salient features and how they basically approximate to the liberal principles, how they resemble with any example of a liberal state in any society. We have to see some of the debates in recent years among political scientists on Indian liberalism and Indian liberal tradition. For example, one debate which comes to my mind is between Sunil Khilnani, who authored a very interesting book or account of Indian politics and Indian thought, that is Idea of India, and the kind of retort he got from another political scientist, Rajiv Bhargav, particularly through his paper Democratic Vision of a New Republic, India since 1950, and this paper appeared in an edited book by Francine Frankel, Transforming India. So therefore, we find that this debate between Khilnani and Rajiv Bhargav throws valuable lights, gives valuable insights on this issue, that is liberalism and liberal tradition in India. And therefore, it can be very useful to understand the working and basically working of the liberal state in India. Now, let's begin with the Khilnani's argument in Idea of India, so far as this liberal tradition is concerned. What is Khilnani's argument? Khilnani offers 3-4 sets of argument. The first, he says that Indian liberalism from the very beginning was stillborn because it was it didn't so much prospect, Then he also says that this Indian liberalism was produced by British utilitarianism in India, because of course, one thing is very clear, that one of the leading utilitarian thinkers, James Mill, was associated with East India Company. And impact of British utilitarians on Indian colonial state and colonial modernity is quite well known. So therefore, he argues that Indian liberalism was produced by British utilitarianism, and therefore it was from the very beginning wedded to the idea of collectivist calculus, which is basically the hallmark of utilitarianism. And the third, he says that this liberalism, that Indian liberalism, was inherently collectivist in its ethos, and therefore it was collectivist not because of simply its lineage in this colonial state and British utilitarianism, but it was also on account of the fact that Indian society was inherently collectivist in ethos, and particularly Indian tradition was collectivist in ethos. So therefore, this collectivity was the most prominent aspect of Indian liberalism, which in Khilnani's opinion shouldn't have been there, because ultimately liberalism should be wedded to the idea of individual ethos, individual rights and individual identity. The third argument of Khilnani is that liberty in Indian context by the liberal elites or liberal middle class or the liberal thinkers or the founding fathers or the leaders of India's freedom movement, liberty was essentially understood not as an individual right the way it was understood in the West, but nation's collective right to self-determination. So nation as a collective identity, and therefore nation's right to self-determination was more paramount in the minds of the liberal thinkers than individual right or individual liberty. So therefore, in fact, this entire freedom movement was meant to seek a right to self-determination for nation, the collectivity, and therefore individual was basically subservient to this entire discourse. Now, of course, this is there is no denying this fact, but this is one of the argument of Khilnani in support of the argument that Indian case cannot be considered purely liberal, to the extent that he also goes and goes to the extent of making the statement that in India this entire liberal tradition, liberal state or liberal institutions were created in fit of absent-mindedness. I am coming to that issue. So the fourth, after looking at this collective nation's collective right to self-determination as a hallmark of Indian liberalism, Khilnani's next argument is that liberal democracy was imposed in India on an unsuspecting mass who were uninitiated in liberalism, and by an elite who lacked self-confidence, and they were also unaware of the larger implication of a decision which was basically taken in the pit of absent-mindedness. This is what I was referring to earlier. So basically, two things here. First of all, that this liberal democracy and liberal values and liberal institutions, or one can say the liberal state in the sense in which we are discussing this topic today, was imposed on unsuspecting mass who were uninitiated in liberalism because they didn't have any exposure to the liberal values and liberal ideas. It was totally an outlandish idea for these people. So therefore, it was imposed by an elite who themselves lacked self-confidence, and they were also unaware the larger implication of this decision which they were imposing on this unsuspecting mass, because they did it in the pit of absent-mindedness. So this is a very serious charge made by Khilnani so far as this Indian liberalism, Indian liberal tradition and the liberal state is concerned. Now, the kind of response which Rajiv Bhargava has given is deserves some attention. Now, Bhargava, as I mentioned, in response to Khilnani's ideas, particularly in this book Idea of India, in this paper Democratic Vision of New Republic, Bhargava writes that utilitarianism, both the way it was born in the West and particularly the Indian nation did not lack awareness or recognition of the worth of individual and their inalienable rights. So it is not proper to say that either in utilitarianism or the Indian nationalism they were totally unaware about the worth of individual rights, and those rights were inalienable. They also knew it very well. Therefore, what he basically suggests that this collectivity was of course a fact, both about utilitarianism and the Indian liberal elites, but nonetheless they also understood the value of individual rights and individuals inalienability of individual worth and individual identity. The second response of Bhargav to Khilnani on issue of this liberal tradition, liberal values in India is that this collectivist struggle against absolute monarchy, or one can say in Indian context it could be put as the collectivist struggle against the colonial power cannot be considered less liberal, because any rebellion, any revolt, any fight, any struggle against absolutism, be it absolute monarch or be it absolute state or unresponsive state, unrepresentative state, such struggles have to be seen as a liberal moments in the life of any society. And therefore, this entire collectivist struggle which Khilnani refers to, the struggle of Indian people for the self-determination of its nation, this was not less liberal according to Bhargav. Rather, one can see it as a high point of any liberal politics in any society. And in India, if this was the case, it was basically the expression of the aspiration for the right to self-determination, for this collectivist identity that is called nation, then it was as liberal as anything else. And the third, he says that the concern of Indian elites for economic equality and justice, which of course were part of integral part of Indian discourse of liberalism, as I was referring, particularly in 20th century. In fact, Bhargav says that one could see the similar traits in the later developments of liberalism in the West. And here he refers, gives the example of Green, Hobhouse and many other liberal thinkers of 20th century. This is what I was referring to, that sometimes their ideas resemble so closely with socialism, of course the Fabian brand of socialism or some other brands of socialism, that it becomes difficult to distinguish liberalism and socialism in terms of their commitment for social justice, economic justice, equality and rights. So therefore, in fact, Bhargav says that this was not true about only Indian liberalism, but even Western liberalism had such moments, and those moments could be seen in the thought of Green, Hobhouse, Lasky and many others. So therefore, in fact, it is true that these things were lacking classical liberalism. But then when you talk of liberalism, we cannot restrict our discussion only to the classical liberalism. We have to take into account the later developments, later innovations, later incorporation of new ideas. So therefore, this is the next argument of Bhargav against Khilnani, who basically highlights this collectivist ethos and basically such deviations. And then another thing which he says, Rajiv Bhargav, which is also interesting, he said that both Indian elites and the colonial master, so far this absent-mindedness is concerned, the charge of being absent-mindedness, the charge leveled by Khilnani, Bhargav says that both Indian elites and the colonial masters were absent-minded. It was not only Indian elites who were absent-minded, but colonial masters were also absent-minded, because they were historical agents. Because both of them were performing their historical role, but as a subjective agents, and therefore they were as fallible, the Indian elites were as fallible as perhaps their colonial counterparts, and therefore perhaps the limitation of this historical agent has to be acknowledged, because sometimes they cannot imagine the unintended consequences of their actions. This Weberian paradox of unintended consequence one can simply invoke here to understand this thing. In fact, this both were the historic agents, both were the both were grounded in their subjectivity, and therefore the unintended consequences of their actions they could not have imagined. So therefore this absent-mindedness charge cannot be leveled only against the Indian elites or the Indian liberals, but can also be extended to the colonial masters and the practitioners of colonial power. Now of course in this piece Bhargav also cites from K.M. Panikkar, Sardar K.M. Panikkar, particularly is that famous piece of writing on Indian liberalism, and he says that how individual and group rights were combined in Indian discourse, particularly the way perhaps in 20th century the Western liberalism did it. And therefore one can see that on the one hand you have Ram Mohan Rai, Gokhale, and Nauroji and others, but on the other hand we also had Tilak and many others. So therefore we can see this combination of individual and group rights has been there, the way K.M. Panikkar has looked at it and analyzed it in his book on Indian liberalism. So therefore Rajiv Bhargav gives a very nuanced response to this Sunil Khilnani's charge that India, Indian state or Indian elites basically created a constitutional design on basis of certain liberal principles in fit of absent-mindedness, and they were not aware about the limitations under which they were working. So this debate is significant from the point of view of understanding liberal state in India, because as I have mentioned that it is polarized into two camps. The one camp which basically refuses to recognize Indian state as a liberal state, or the Indian democratic polity to be based on the liberal principles. On the other hand, there are scholars who believe that Indian state is as liberal as any liberal state in the world, because all liberal principles one can see both in constitutional design as well as in the practice of the state power. Now this is important entry point to this issue of the theory of liberal state in India. Of course now you have to see that how constitution was drafted, how Constituent Assembly created a vision for a liberal India or a liberal politics in India, and how this preamble, fundamental right, directive principles of a state policy, separation of power, rule of law, federalism, all these provisions suggest that fact. But at the same time, apart from this constitutionalism, Indian constitutionalism, we have to see the twist and turn in this entire working of liberal state in India, be it the abolition of right to property, a very important aspect of any liberal society or liberal state, be it the promulgation of emergency in 1975, or one can say the kind of majoritarian turn in Indian democracy in recent years. All these things are suggestive of the fact that Indian liberal state or liberal state in India, the way it has conducted itself, there are both twists and turns, but nonetheless, it is a surviving, story of a liberal state institutions and state power.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on the particular topic. And friends, if you have any feedbacks or questions regarding the lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We are going to meet again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.